In the German city of Hamelin, you can buy rat-shaped bread. It is a strange, buttery thing to eat while walking down a street where music is strictly banned. Specifically, the Bungelosenstrasse, the street without drums. For generations, no one has been allowed to play a flute, a violin, or even to dance on this pavement. This isn't some quirky local tradition. It's a civic memory of a void. On June 26, 1284, 130 children vanished. Most of you probably know this as a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, but for Hamelin, it's not a story. It's a ledger of loss. We're going to strip away the folklore to find the actual human trauma beneath the music. Hamelin is a small, quiet town in northern Germany, sitting right on the banks of the Weser River. Today, it has about 60,000 residents. To a visitor, it looks like a postcard of the Middle Ages, with well-preserved medieval houses lining the streets. But in the 13th century, this wasn't just a quiet village. It was a strategically important hub, part of a river network that connected it to major trade routes and centers like Hanover and Braunschweig within the Holy Roman Empire. Then there is the Bungelosenstrasse. Locals interpret the name as the street without drums. It's a very specific, very quiet place. For centuries, music and dancing were banned here because it was the exact path that children took when they vanished. This prohibition remained strict through the middle of the 18th century, and even now, no one is allowed to play music or dance on the Bungelosenstrasse. It is a street that exists simply to remember a silence that started 700 years ago. June 26, 1284. This is the date carved into a 17th century inscription on the House of the Piper on Bungelosenstrasse. It marks a very specific kind of failure. According to the records, a man in colorful clothing had arrived in Hamelin, promising to rid the town of a rat plague in exchange for a reward. He did the job, but the town didn't pay him. He returned on June 26th, St. John's and St. Paul's Day. While the townspeople were assembled at church, the piper appeared. He wasn't wearing colorful clothing this time. He was dressed in a hunter's costume with a strange red hat and a dreadful look on his face. He didn't come for the money. He came for the children. He began to play his fife. The sound attracted children from their 4th year on, including the mayor's grown daughter. It was a systematic collection. He led the children out of town, and they were never to be seen again. A babysitter carrying a child in her arms followed the group from a distance. She was the one who reported the event to the town. She watched as the piper led 130 children into a mountain cave, where he and the children disappeared. A shocking act of retribution, delivered with a flute. Records don't just rely on memory. There are fragments of chronicles from northern Germany, written between the late 14th and 15th centuries, that confirm a collective disappearance of children. One specific 1384 note explicitly states, "It is 100 years since our children left." This isn't a fairy tale, it's a ledger of loss. For centuries, the town kept visual reminders. Around the year 1300, the Marktkirche, Hamelin's parish church, featured a stained glass window depicting a colorfully dressed figure leading children dressed in white. This window remained part of the urban landscape until the 1600s, specifically around 1660, when it was destroyed. But the trauma persisted in stone. A stone slab from 1556 calculates the years passed since the disappearance. A fragment of a town gate, also built in 1556, mentions the disappearance of the children. Later chronicles simply confirm that a large group of children born in Hamelin left the city and never returned. The evidence is concrete. The children are gone, and the town just kept counting the years. If you have read the fairy tales, you know the rats. Thousands of rats invaded Hamelin, entering houses, contaminating food, and biting children. The people were desperate. Then came the stranger, a foreigner, a traveler who claimed to be a rat catcher. He wore multicolored clothes, bright red and yellow cloth, and promised to rid the town of Vermin for a certain sum of money. The mayor of Hamelin accepted the offer immediately. A deal was struck, promising him a price of several hundred guilders. Some accounts say 1,000 guilders. He played his small fife, a simple melody that put the rats and mice in a trance. He led them to the river Weser, where he walked into the frothing water and the animals drowned. Within the hour, the rats were no longer a threat. But the burgermeister and the citizens refused to pay the fee. They made excuses to avoid the 50 guilders or the agreed price, and the piper, infuriated and bitter, left the town, vowing to return for revenge. Now, here is the strange part. The Lunenburg manuscript and the original account from 1284, including the descriptions of the glass window, do not mention rats at all. There is no mention of rats in the early texts or medieval chronicles. The rat catcher detail is not attested until the mid-1500s, 3 centuries after the event. The rats were simply added centuries later to give the legend a moral tone. Since the original records omit the rats, historians have spent centuries trying to figure out what actually happened to those 130 children. Some suggest the story reflects a real tragedy, such as an epidemic, a landslide, or a mass drowning. Near the Weser River, subsurface collapses could have caused sudden entrapment or drownings, turning a riverbank into a grave. Then there is the darker, more rhythmic side of the tragedy. In medieval Europe, death was often personified as a piper or fiddler in the danse macabre. This aligns with the concept of dancing mania, also known as choria sancta viti, where groups of people danced in trances during the 13th and 16th centuries. In 1237, children reportedly danced from Erfurt to Einhausen until they collapsed. Similar episodes of chorea mania, such as the St. Vitus dance in Strasbourg in 1518, involved people who believed they heard music during their trance. Other theories look for a human hand. Some link the event to itinerant preachers who rallied child crusaders for the Children's Crusade of 1212. In this version, the piper was simply a recruiter for the crusade, leading the children toward the Holy Land, where they were eventually sold into slavery. Historian William Manchester suggested the legend might have masked a series of child murders or abductions by a predator. To understand how societies process loss, we can look at the case of William of Norwich in 1144, where a dead child was found and Jews were falsely accused. It shows how a town creates a narrative to explain an inexplicable loss. And then there is the rat. In some versions, a single surviving rat returned to its country, Ratonia, and described the mechanism of attraction that led it to the river. It described feeling powerfully attracted, despite knowing it would die. Let's look at the map. During the 11th century, northern Germany experienced population growth and land shortages, which forced young people to look toward the east. In medieval Hamelin, children worked from a young age, learning trades and collaborating at home. But there was a problem. In 13th century Germany, the legal concept of primogeniture meant younger sons had few prospects. This is where the locator enters the frame. A locator was essentially a recruitment agent. He was a central figure in medieval migration, responsible for finding land and gathering settlers under the Ius Teutonicum German law. These locators were sharp-dressed middlemen who recruited colonists across the Holy Roman Empire to settle in Brandenburg, Pomerania, Silesia, and Transylvania. If the piper was a locator, he wasn't a magical monster, but a recruiter. One academic theory suggests the children participated in an organized migration to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, known as Ostsiedling. This movement toward the Baltic and the emigration model meant feudal lords and church authorities offered land and tax exemptions to attract young settlers. Linguist Jürgen Udolph traced medieval surnames and found matches between 11th century Hamelin names and current surnames in regions like Uckermark, Prignitz, Pomerania, and Beverlo in Germany and Poland. Surnames like Hamel, Hamler, or Hamelnikoff are interpreted as traces of this migration. We even see place name twins, such as Beveling and Beveling, marching toward modern Poland. Historians believe that the children of the town in medieval civic language often meant townspeople, not literal children. In medieval German, the word Kinder could refer to young people or adolescents, not just small fry. Therefore, the piper, who many accounts agree was guided by a man, sometimes associated with music, was likely a jongleur, bagpiper, or flutist. These musicians were common in medieval fairs and processions. Another hypothesis suggests the children were sold or delivered as settlers by recruiters. In this scenario, the piper may have been a trafficker, acting as an intermediary between recruiters and the children and the city, leading them toward the Baltic region and Eastern Europe. It is a strange shift in perspective. We move from a supernatural monster to a man with a job. A locator was essentially a recruitment agent, and the horror here isn't magic, but the efficiency of a sales pitch. There is something more unsettling about a man who can convince an entire generation to walk away from their homes. The term Pied Piper eventually became shorthand for a charismatic leader, con man, or anyone with dangerous charisma. It suggests that the most dangerous thing in Hamelin wasn't a flute, but the ability to lead people toward a void by simply sounding promising. There is a specific, clinical kind of silence that follows a mass disappearance. In some accounts, the children were led toward a nearby hill known as Koppenberg. But there is a detail that often gets lost. Some children were left behind. Specifically, the blind, the mute, and the lame. They were the only ones who couldn't follow the music. This reveals something about the mechanism of the pipe. If the pipe was a signal, it was one that only the able-bodied and the young could respond to. Those who were broken in the eyes of the same society were the only ones who escaped. The town of Hamelin didn't record a massacre, they recorded a void. A group of 130 people who walked toward the Koppenberg mountain and simply stopped being part of the town's census. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe referenced the Pied Piper in an unfinished 1803 poem called Der Rottenfänger. By the time Robert Browning wrote his 1842 poem, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, A Child's Story, the tragedy was already becoming a piece of entertainment. The brothers Grimm, working in the early 19th century, collected and spread the story as a fairy tale in their collections, like Deutsche Sagen between 1816 and 1818. They documented various Germanic fairy tales from oral storytelling traditions, effectively turning a civic trauma into a moral fable. By the 20th century, the story had been stripped of its original horror entirely. Looney Tunes reimagined the Piper as the characters of Porky Pig and Sylvester the Cat. A mass disappearance of 130 children is now a cartoon. Some stories refused to end with a simple migration map. Folklore claimed the lost children of Hamelin re-emerged in Transylvania via caves, as if the earth itself had functioned as a tunnel to the east. It is a convenient narrative for a town that couldn't face the truth of a recruiter. When we look at the logistics of 1284, the gap in the record becomes more glaring. There is no record of severe famine or war in Hamelin in 1284. No desperate starvation, no invading army, just a town that woke up and found its future missing. The migration theory explains the where, but it doesn't explain why the memory mutated into a monster. Why the town preferred the idea of a magical abduction over the reality of a salesman who simply convinced their children that there was something better waiting across the horizon. June 26th, 1284. A date that is not a fairy tale, but a census error that never got corrected. The town of Hamelin still keeps its Bungalowsenstrasse, a street where music is banned to honor a silence that has lasted 7 centuries. We have a story about a magical flute and a river full of rats, but the archives suggest something far more mundane and far more chilling. A man with a colorful coat and a convincing voice who walked away with 130 of the town's youth. The most absurd part is that we now eat rat-shaped bread in the city to commemorate the event. We have turned a void into a tourist attraction, replacing the trauma of a missing generation with a melody. The children are still gone, and the only thing that remains is the street where no one is allowed to dance.